I was still freshly graduated and working my first real job in the city. Some coworkers invited me to go for drinks with them on a Friday night to celebrate my first month on the team. I had an amazing time, and it was awesome to get to know them in such a casual and different environment. However, since I was only 19, I stuck to soda while everyone else went through rounds of cocktails. As the night wound down, a heavy knot formed in my stomach. My coworkers had insisted I treat them to a round of appetizers to celebrate my first paycheck. Between that and the looming deadline for my house rent, my bank account was terrifyingly low. I checked my banking app. The balance was barely enough to cover my rent, let alone a surge. Priced Uber across the city. By the time things wrapped up, I started calling around to some friends and family to see who was free to give me a ride home. I found out everyone with a car was either drunk, asleep, or both. I realized that if I was going to get home that night, I either had to hitch a ride with a total stranger or walk a heck of a long way on my own in the dark. As I couldn't afford a professional ride and I couldn't afford to lose my apartment, but the idea of the first thing scared the ever-living hell out of me. So I chose the second thing and started walking. I cannot overstate how glad I was that I chose to wear sneakers that night. The city streets were eerily quiet. About 20 minutes into the trek, a car slowed down beside me. The driver was a young man, clutching a roll of blueprints. He looked barely older than me, maybe 20. He looked harmless, almost stressed to the point of tears. "Please," he said, "I'm looking for the municipal planning office. I have a deadline and I'm lost." I stepped closer to the curb to point the way. But as I did, the back door flew open. A woman leapt out from the back. She was well built, maybe 45 years old, and stood a towering 5'10". She had the look of a heavy drug user with deep, dark circles that made her look like a ghost. As I tried to back away, the woman lunged at me and we crashed into each other. I didn't just run, I fought back. She swung a heavy hand at my head and I ducked. I shoved my palms into her chest to create distance. She hissed at me, grabbing a handful of my hair, and for a terrifying moment we were locked in a struggle. Realizing I couldn't outfight her, I turned and bolted toward the side of the road. There was a heavy iron window grill attached to the front of a closed basement-level shop. I dived for it, wrapping my arms through the cold metal bars and locking my fingers together in a death grip. I knew that if they couldn't pull me off, they couldn't get me into the car. The driver then hopped out of the front to help his mother, and I realized then how small he was. He was a dwarf man who looked to be only 5 feet in height. He grabbed my waist and started pulling with everything he had.
"I want her,"
he demanded, his voice high-pitched and eerie.
"Mother, I want her."
The woman joined him, her large, rough hands wrapping around my wrists, trying to pry my fingers off the iron. I screamed until my throat felt like it was bleeding, kicking backward at anyone who touched me. The woman slammed her shoulder into me to try and knock the wind out of me, but I only squeezed the metal bars tighter, the iron digging painfully into my chest. Just as my strength began to fail, a tall black man appeared from the shadows of a nearby park entrance. He didn't hesitate. He shouted at the top of his lungs, charging toward the car. He had a heavy flashlight in his hand. As he ran, his voice boomed with a protective authority that seemed to shake the pavement, making it clear he wasn't just a witness, but a guardian. The sight of him coming for help broke their resolve. The woman let go of me, first cursing under her breath, her dark circled eyes snapping toward the newcomer. The young man let out a frustrated cry, but realized they were outmatched. They scrambled back into the car, the tires screeching as they sped away into the night. The man reached me seconds later, checking to see if I was hurt. I was shaking so hard I could barely stand, but I was safe. He stayed with me, calling the police and waiting until the patrol car arrived to ensure I got home. The man spoke in a soft voice to keep me calm. He told me his name was Marcus, and he lived nearby. He gave me his jacket because I was shivering from the cold and the fear. The police arrived quickly with their bright flashing lights. I told them everything that happened while Marcus stood by my side. They took notes and searched the area for the car. I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. I realized how lucky I was that Marcus had been there. That night changed my whole life. I never walk alone anymore. I still think about that night, and how a pair of sneakers and that iron grill were the only things that stood between me and a nightmare.
I am originally from Belarus, though I live in the United States now. I obtained my very first job under the table during the early to mid-1990s. At the time, I was only 12 or 13 years old. My role was to serve as a helper in my father's barbershop. My duties were simple. I spent most of my time sweeping up piles of hair, scrubbing the bathroom, taking out the trash, and handling various chores of that nature. We lived and worked in a small area located near the border with Poland. This was a pivotal era in history because Lukashenko had just ascended to power, and the Soviet Union had recently dissolved. These were incredibly difficult and dark times for everyone in the region. Mass starvation and crushing poverty swallowed the land entirely. In fact, these systemic problems still plague that area today. But I should get back to the story. I was at the barbershop with my father, whom I called Papa. We really only saw the same few regulars every week. Most people in our area chose to cut their own hair or had a family member do it. Maintaining a barbershop was actually one of the only private enterprises possible during the Soviet Union era. As the day went by, the sky began to grow dark. Papa told me to finish cleaning up and then head right home. After giving me this lecture, he left me alone in the barbershop so he could go find a place to drink by himself. I finished my chores as instructed, locked the front door, and finally began the long walk home. This was a very rural area. It wasn't exactly the deep countryside, but everything was spaced out significantly. It was hard to maintain any real sense of community there, so everyone usually stuck to themselves and valued their privacy. As I was walking along the road, I suddenly realized that I had forgotten to take out the final bag of garbage. I turned around to head back to the shop. When I turned, I noticed a Lada driving behind me. The strange thing was that it had no lights on. I believe the driver was actually coasting, as there was no audible sound of an engine humming. We were also traveling slightly downhill. Since I had reversed, I was walking uphill. The car passed me by and I felt somewhat at ease. However, when the Lada reached the bottom of the hill, the driver cranked the engine on and made a sudden U-turn. They pulled up right beside me. I could see a man and a woman sitting inside. The man driving the car called out to me, asking if I wanted a lift to wherever I was going. I told them no thanks and explained my destination was nearby. I also honestly told them that they were severely creeping me out. They became visibly offended that I had called them creepy. They began to yell at me loudly, calling me all sorts of nasty names and shouting at me. They hoped I would slip and crack my head open on the ground. Figuring they were probably just drunk and belligerent, I told them to F off. Then, I cut through the grass and trees to get off the road. I took a shortcut through a small wooded area that I knew would eventually link back to the street on the other side. I assumed that by the time I reached the exit, some time would have passed and they would be gone. Yet, when I reached the other side, the same Lada was idling on the road waiting. At this point, I was getting extremely agitated rather than scared. I came from a home with an alcoholic father and was a Slav squat kid. I was quite used to confronting aggressive adults. With my attitude, that also meant I was used to being beaten by adults. Because of this, random people acting tough didn't intimidate me much. It sounds edgy, but you get used to it. You learn to read a person to see if they're actually going to attack a child. You would be surprised by how many adults actually do. Filled with anger, I walked directly up to the car and confronted the man. I asked him why he was following me, and if he liked me or wanted a kid for some reason. I told him he should go be with the woman in the car and leave me alone. The man paused for a second and then put his hand up to the window. He was holding a gun, or at least something that looked exactly like one. It was dark, so I couldn't see perfectly. He told me that I could either have a good night or my last night. He said that if I got in the car, we could drive around and drink vodka. But if I refused, he would kill me. Ironically, while I had been in plenty of fistfights with adults before, I had never been confronted with a firearm. I didn't know exactly what to do, but I knew for certain I wasn't getting into that freak's car. I hesitated for a moment and then lied. I told him okay and said I would get in, acting as if I were going along with their plan. I walked over to the passenger side of the vehicle. The woman opened her door and got out to let me into the back seat. I believe she was about to say something patronizing like "good boy," but as she stepped out, I kicked her in the leg. I kicked as hard as I possibly could and immediately bolted. She yelped in pain and fell over. By the time they realized what had happened, I was already back in the safety of the trees. It was a circular wooded area surrounded by roads, similar to a large roundabout, which allowed me to get to the center where they couldn't see me. They had no way of knowing which side I would eventually come out on. I sat and waited in the dark center for a long time. Once I decided enough time had passed, I exited on the side nearest the barbershop. I sprinted from the woods, up the road, and straight back into the shop. I unlocked the door, jumped inside, locked it behind me, and stayed there for the entire night. In the morning, my father showed up at the shop. Instead of being relieved, he beat me for never coming home. I tried to explain the kidnapping attempt and even tried to describe the car in detail, but that only made him angrier. He accused me of lying and told me I was just using stories from the news. Unfortunately, these types of events were common back then. It wasn't an everyday occurrence for one person, but reported kidnappings had become as common as car break-ins are in America. It turned out these two people had gone around the entire village that day, asking any kids they saw if they wanted a lift. There were other reports of them making threats as well. After my experience, I paid very close attention to the news in hopes of seeing that those people had been caught. Instead, I only saw headlines about more children going missing. There was a terrifying abundance of missing kids over those few months. It was widely assumed that these children had their organs harvested, were trafficked to other countries, or were even killed and eaten due to the mass starvation. Unless you were like my family or were relatively wealthy by the standards of the day, it was very likely that you didn't eat much at all. This desperation led to unspeakable horrors.
Last summer, I was 21 years old and enjoying a family vacation at Myrtle Beach. We were staying in a high-rise resort, positioned somewhere around the 13th or 14th floor in a timeshare unit. One particular night, restlessness took hold of me. I found myself tossing and turning, unable to find the comfort of sleep. By 3 a.m., the quiet of the room became stifling. Consequently, I decided to step out onto the balcony to breathe in some fresh night air. The sight from the balcony was breathtaking. A full moon hung in the sky, casting a brilliant, shimmering path of light across the ocean waves. Looking down, I noticed the beach was entirely deserted, a rare sight for such a popular destination. The stillness was captivating. Since sleep remained elusive, I figured a short walk on the sand might help me relax. I planned to listen to some music and clear my head, hoping that a bit of physical activity would finally make me tired enough to rest. In hindsight, it was a foolish and unsafe decision to head out alone at that hour. However, because my family was fast asleep, I chose not to wake anyone or leave a note. I rationalized the choice by telling myself I would only be gone for 10 or 15 minutes. I just wanted a quick moment of solitude before returning to bed. The base of our resort featured a pool area and an outdoor bar. Beyond that, two separate boardwalks, spaced about 100 feet apart, led through the tall seagrass and down to the shore. When I reached the ground level, the resort grounds were as empty as the beach had appeared from above. I chose the boardwalk on the right and began making my way toward the water. As I walked down the wooden path, a figure appeared, coming from the direction of the beach. This caught me off guard because I had just scanned that very area from my balcony and hadn't seen a single soul. My pulse quickened slightly as the person drew closer. Under the dim glow of the outdoor bar lights, I could see it was a man, likely in his late 30s. He wore a backpack and a pair of glasses with large, square frames. He looked incredibly tense and alert, scanning his surroundings as if he were searching for someone or expecting a clandestine meeting. His clothes appeared tattered and worn. As we crossed paths, we made brief eye contact. I gave him a small, polite nod and continued past him, but a wave of unease washed over me. He reminded me strangely of Jeffrey Dahmer because of those glasses, and he didn't look like someone who was staying at a high-end resort. I tried to dismiss the feeling, putting my headphones in to focus on the music. Upon reaching the sand, I turned right and began walking parallel to the ocean. I took off my shoes and moved closer to the shoreline so I could feel the cool water on my feet. I walked for about a minute, trying to enjoy the scenery. A sudden, primal instinct told me that something was wrong. I pulled my headphones down and glanced over my shoulder. A dark figure was trailing me further up the shore, positioned strategically between me and the resort. Based on the man's height and movement, I knew immediately it was the same person I had passed on the boardwalk. Panic began to set in, and my mind flooded with every horror story I had ever heard. Still, I tried to remain logical. I told myself it might just be a coincidence. Perhaps the man had simply decided to take a walk as well, and happened to be moving in the same direction. To calm my nerves, I took a few deep breaths and turned my gaze back toward the horizon, maintaining my pace. After a few more seconds, I checked again. My heart sank when I realized he had closed the gap significantly. He wasn't just walking parallel to me anymore. He was angled directly toward me. I quickened my pace, and to my horror, he immediately matched my speed, continuing his diagonal path toward the water's edge. A part of me tried to deny the reality of the situation. I thought that maybe he just preferred walking by the water and wasn't actually stalking me. Seeking to confirm my theory, I performed a complete 180-degree turn and started walking the opposite way. As I turned my head, I saw him mirror my movement perfectly. He was now power walking, aggressively closing the distance between us. The gravity of the situation finally hit me. I broke into a full run along the shoreline. He immediately began running too. He stayed higher up on the beach, cutting off my path to the resort boardwalks. If I tried to head for safety, he would be able to intercept me before I reached the stairs. With no clear plan, I simply kept running. I was young and relatively fit, so I hoped I could outlast him. I hoped I could find another exit further down the beach, and eventually find a way back to the road or call for help. We ran like that for what felt like 15 minutes. The most terrifying aspect was the absolute silence of the night. There was no wind, no voices, only the sound of my own heavy breathing and the rhythmic thud of my feet hitting the wet sand. Every time I looked back, his shadowy figure was there, keeping pace and lurking in the darkness upshore. Eventually, I spotted a small, flickering blue light ahead on the sand. As I got closer, I saw a group of 4 people sitting on a blanket. They were positioned higher up on the beach. I decided to make a break for them, thinking that even if he tried to cut me off, I could reach them first. I hoped that by alerting them, we could confront the man together. I used the last of my energy to sprint toward the group. However, as I arrived, my hope vanished. The scene was one of total intoxication. There were 4 men surrounded by several large bottles of liquor. Most were empty, and the last was nearly gone. 3 of the men were completely passed out, unresponsive to the world. The 4th man was barely upright, wearing a party hat adorned with blue LED lights. He was mumbling to himself, his eyes glazed over and half closed. He didn't even notice me standing 5 feet away from him. I looked back and saw that my pursuer had slowed down. He was watching me, and I could almost see him processing the state of the group. Realizing they were no threat to him and no help to me, he suddenly began sprinting toward me again. As he entered the glow of the blue party lights, his face became clear. He looked manic, his eyes wide and fixed on me as he barreled forward at full speed. I knew I had to do something drastic. I had exhausted myself sprinting to the drunk group. I feared that, in a long-distance race, he might eventually overtake me. Instead of turning and running away from him, I suddenly lunged forward, sprinting directly toward him and then veering sharply to the right. The move caught him completely off guard. He stumbled as he tried to adjust his momentum, allowing me to slip past him. I didn't look back. I just ran with every ounce of strength I had left toward the resort. The adrenaline was overwhelming. It felt like one of those nightmares where a killer is inches away from grabbing you. Every hair on my neck was standing on end. As the resort loomed closer, I finally dared to glance over my shoulder. He was still following, but he was now 400 or 500 feet behind me. He had lost significant ground. I didn't slow down for a second. I raced up the boardwalk and burst into the resort area. I reached the elevators and pounded the buttons until the doors opened. Once inside, I frantically mashed the closed door button, gasping for air as the metal sliders finally met. When I reached my floor, I sprinted down the hallway, fumbled with my key, and practically fell into the room. I slammed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and leaned against the wood, trembling. I stayed on the floor for a long time, my chest heaving, trying to process the terror of the last 30 minutes. I eventually crawled to my bedroom, staying low to the floor because I was terrified he might be able to see me through the balcony glass from somewhere outside. Needless to say, I stayed awake until the sun came up and I never went for a late-night walk alone again.
Our family lives for the Christmas season. We are exactly the kind of people who start decorating in the middle of November, much to the annoyance of some. We have even turned the first yearly play of Maria Carey's holiday anthem into a sacred family ritual. My husband and our 3 daughters always dress in matching pajamas, a tradition that never fails to make me smile. Even though the stress of cooking a massive dinner can be overwhelming, I truly love being the heart of the family, the home where all the relatives gather when December arrives. However, there is a significant complication to our festive spirit. We are Australian. To explain for those elsewhere, while Christmas is a winter affair in America and Europe, December in Australia falls during the peak of summer. Down under, you are far more likely to be wearing a Santa hat while sunbathing than you are to be sipping eggnog by a cozy fire. Despite the heat, our holiday imagery is filled with snow-covered landscapes and red-breasted robins perched on pine trees. In Darwin, where we live, we have palm trees instead of pines. My daughters had never actually seen real snow, and by 2019, we decided it was time to change that. We ignored the people who called us crazy and booked flights to Europe for late November. The journey was incredible. While I found the long flights to be a grueling ordeal, seeing Europe's historic landmarks dusted in snow made every cramped hour in the airplane feel worthwhile. Our itinerary took us through Prague, Berlin, Rome, Copenhagen, Paris, and London. Despite the beauty of those cities, my family was most excited about visiting Ireland. The girls had convinced themselves that Ireland was a magical realm, inhabited by fairies, while my husband was equally enthusiastic about the prospect of tasting Guinness straight from the tap. When we arrived in Cork, we checked into a charming Airbnb in the suburbs. It was a semi-detached house that looked like it had been plucked straight from a storybook. Before anyone had even unpacked, the girls were already asking for the internet password. My husband works in IT, and he is very passionate about internet safety. He views it not just as a job, but as a vital way to protect our daughters from the darker corners of the web. Whenever we stay in a new place, he makes it a point to scan the network to ensure everything is secure and that parental locks are active. As I sat drinking a cup of coffee, I watched him working on his laptop and noticed a specific troubled expression on his face that I knew meant he had found something concerning. I sat down next to him on the couch and looked at the screen, though the technical data looked like nonsense to me. I had to ask him to explain what was wrong. He pointed to a specific line of text and explained that a device was already connected to the Wi-Fi when we arrived. He accounted for our own phones and his laptop, but there was one mystery device remaining. He then opened a new window and pointed to an icon that was unmistakably the symbol for a camera. Trying to stay positive, I suggested it might just be an outdoor security camera for the property. My husband decided to walk around the entire building, but he returned saying he couldn't find a device anywhere on the exterior. He went back to his computer to use his technical skills, and a few minutes later, he called me into the kitchen. His voice had that specific dad tone, serious and urgent, but controlled so as not to alert the children that something was wrong. His eyes were wide as he showed me the laptop screen. It displayed a live video feed of the bedroom where our daughters were supposed to sleep. The view was from above, as if the camera were mounted on the ceiling. We immediately ran upstairs to the girls' room to investigate. We discovered the camera hidden inside a smoke detector, located directly over one of the beds. It was a terrifying realization that someone had planned to watch our daughters while they slept. It was easily the creepiest experience our family had ever faced. My husband called the property owner immediately to demand an explanation for the camera in the children's room. At first, the owner claimed there was no CCTV on the property at all. He even had the audacity to suggest that the video feed must be coming from a different house in the neighborhood, which was a ridiculous lie since I could clearly see my own children on the screen. My husband eventually had to threaten to send the owner a screenshot of the live feed before the man would admit the camera was theirs. The owner then tried to excuse it by claiming they were simply trying to protect their investment. My husband didn't buy the excuse and accused the man of being a voyeur, stating that we would be reporting the incident to Airbnb immediately. At that point, the owner became flustered and silent before abruptly hanging up the phone. We had called him out for being a creep, and he had no defense for his actions. We were furious and deeply unsettled, realizing we had only narrowly prevented a stranger from watching our kids all night. Even though it was late, we had the girls pack their bags while we searched for a nearby hotel. It took several months of back and forth emails with Airbnb's customer service, but we eventually received the full refund we deserved. Airbnb also informed us that they had banned the homeowner from the platform. That news provided me with much more peace of mind than the money did. I have always known that people with such dark desires exist, but I never expected to encounter one myself, especially during what was supposed to be a dream vacation. My main concern now is whether Airbnb can truly keep people like that off their site. My husband and I have asked them about the systems they use to ensure guest safety, but their answers have been far from satisfying. We pointed out that a person like that could easily create a new account using a friend's or relative's name to continue recording children without anyone knowing. The legalistic response we received essentially admitted they had no real solution for that possibility. That is the fear that stays with me. I worry that somewhere else, a child is sleeping peacefully while a stranger watches them, and there is nothing being done to stop it.
Have any of you given that Bumble app a go? I know it seems massively counterintuitive to download an app which requires the girl to make the first move, when they're notoriously not the ones to make the first move. But I can assure you, it's definitely worth it. But at the same time, I think the single worst thing that happened to me in 2020 took place just as a result of a Bumble date. So it all started when I matched with a Welsh girl named Lima. After a day or two of talking, we agreed to meet at a little cafe for a few coffees. We hit it off talking about this and that, and before you know it, we were chatting like we'd known each other for years. 1 hour turned to 2, 2 to 3, and still neither of us was ready to call time on the date. Neither of us drank alcohol that evening. Her for religious reasons, me because I'm something of a fitness freak. But while she was drinking mocktails, I was on the coffee, and I was on it big time. There came a point where I needed a wee so badly because of my medical issues. The wait became an absolute nightmare. I was struggling to keep my composure while waiting for the one-person toilet to be free. This happened every half an hour without fail almost all night. I had to interrupt her, apologize, and leg it off to the little bathroom to relieve myself. I felt like an absolute idiot having to nip off to the lavs so often. But every time I emerged, she'd look up and smile, waving away my apologies with some light mockery of how I have the bladder of a 4-year-old. But one time, I emerged from the toilet to see that she was no longer sitting alone, and that someone was sitting in my seat. At first, I thought she'd just bumped into a guy she knew. She certainly looked quite comfortable talking to him, but it turned out to be the complete opposite. I walked up behind him and playfully put my hands on his shoulders. I told him in a joking way that he might be in my seat. It wasn't confrontational or aggressive, just pure banter. I expected the guy to jump up, maybe warmly apologize, maybe give a little introduction, something like that. But he didn't. He looked back at me with this look on his face that clearly signaled he wanted me to get my hands off him immediately. And as he was staring up at me, Lima shot me a look as if to ask for help. Only then did I realize the situation was not what I thought, and I asked if they actually knew each other. Turns out this bloke had been sitting alone enjoying some food and wine and had been making eyes at Lima every so often. Then, when I'd gone off for a wee, he'd taken his opportunity, sat in my seat, and then began to, as Lima put it, flirt so outrageously forward that she felt like she was going to be sick. Now, I actually had to ask this guy to leave us alone before he got up and finally gave me my chair back, but not before he tried to stare me out. I had a few inches on him, and I could tell he didn't put half the gym time in that I did, so it's not like I was in the least bit intimidated. It just seemed like he was trying really, really hard to be some comic book idea of what women want, and was honestly a little bit pathetic. He looked completely and utterly harmless, like a chocolate pistol. He looked like he'd melt at the first sign of trouble. But as I found out later that night, looks can be dangerously deceiving. So, after the little confrontation at the table, Lima and I laughed it off, then carried on with our night. Now Lima could see over my shoulder and therefore also see the creepy guy, but all I could see in front of me was her and one of the cafe's walls. So I had to rely on her to let me know if the guy was still there. I honestly expected him to just leave after such a confrontation. Everyone in the cafe was watching. It was pretty mortifying, but he didn't. He stayed put and continued to make eyes at Lima, which to her credit she just ignored. But then when it came to me walking her home, he got up and paid his bill too. Then yep, you guessed it. I looked over my shoulder as we were passing through Chinatown, and I saw tiny Mister stare out. He was still keeping up the intimidation game by staring out from under his brow, obviously too drunk to realize he looked far more comical than scary. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't exactly scared at that point, but we were being followed. It made for something of a tense situation, but nothing I thought I couldn't handle. As we approached her apartment block, I asked Lima if she was comfortable going inside while the guy could see where she lived. She admitted to being uncomfortable about it, but the block had dozens of flats in it, and unless he got in the door behind her, there was little chance of him working out which unit she lived in. But as it turned out, Lima was way more concerned about me and actually invited me inside for a nightcap. I didn't assume that I was getting lucky, but I wasn't about to turn her down. So I went inside for a cup of this weird ginger tea and the comfort that our little stalker friend would soon get bored and wander off. I was in her flat for no less than an hour, and by that time, each of us was confident that our new friend had departed. We even checked out of her bathroom window, which looked down into the street, and he was nowhere to be seen. I thanked her for a good night. We had a little smooch, and I started my walk home with that lighter-than-air feeling you get after a successful date. It's around that time that I started thinking about how strange it would be if that loser was somehow still following me, which prompted me to look over my shoulder. Lo and behold, there was a single figure following me, maybe 50 or 60 meters behind, with a remarkably similar silhouette to the lad who'd tried following us. I have to admit to being in a state of disbelief for a moment as I stopped and studied the figure as they approached. Then after passing under a streetlight, I got a clear look at the person. It was him. I said out loud that he had to be joking, and immediately he stopped. I knew it was him, so him playing at being a statue didn't make a blind bit of difference. I just told him to keep his distance, and there'd be no problems. Then just carried on the 20-minute walk back to my place. Every so often I checked over my shoulder, and this lad was still behind me. Granted, he was some way away, but he was definitely following me. And the closer we got to my apartment, the more it became obvious that he was making a considerable effort to close the distance. Now, unlike Lima, the apartment I lived in was just one of two in this big old Edwardian. I had the top floors, while the other tenant had the ground floor and the basement, complete with his entrance. And if this lad saw what door I went into, he'd have my flat. He wouldn't have to guess which one of 60 I was in. He would know exactly where I lived. Obviously, I was not in the least bit comfortable with that, so I decided on a little show of force to deter my new follower. I turned around and just marched right at him. Then, when I was within about spitting distance, I gave him a piece of my mind about being a creep and a loser, promising I'd hurt him if he carried on following me. It seemed to have the desired effect as he started walking off in the complete opposite direction. It was really strange, but I carried on walking, checking over my shoulder one more time, and he was gone. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. About a minute or two went by, and I reached the entrance to a fairly small park. My flat was literally just on the other side of it, so I was in this blissful ignorance of thinking that not only had I scared the creepy guy off, but that I was so close to home that nothing could possibly hurt me now. I mean, I was on home base, right in my big old backyard. Besides, I'd had a great night. I had drinks with this gorgeous anesthesiologist, definitely securing myself a second date in the process, and I'd had myself a little tough guy moment with that absolute idiot. Then everything flashed bright for a second, and I felt my knees just buckling under me, almost as if though my brain had switched off power to them. I honestly don't know if I was knocked out for a second or two, but I do know that the next thing I could feel was this sharp, hot pain in the back left side of my head. I knew that I'd been hit by something, I just didn't know what or by whom. I was so dazed that it didn't even occur to me that it could have been him. I honestly thought I was just being mugged or something, in which case it wouldn't have been my first rodeo. I'd been mugged at knife point in London back when I was a student, and I knew to just keep my mouth shut, hand over the valuables, and get away with nothing but damaged pride and a lump on my head. So the only thing I did before trying to find my feet was to toss out my wallet and phone onto the concrete and tell whoever it was to just take it and leave. I heard someone wheeze a laugh, probably at how pathetic I looked. But when they spoke, I knew exactly who it was. He mocked me, saying he thought I was going to kick his head in and told me to look at myself now. Then he kicked me. They kicked me so hard in the side of the head that I thought my orbital socket might be broken, and in between worrying that I'd end up losing my eye if they kicked me again, it dawned on me the little towel. Rag, who'd been following, had somehow found a way to cut me off and ambush me. And it became quite obvious that I was in much more trouble than I'd first anticipated. The phone and wallet weren't going to cut it. I needed to get on my feet, and fast. It didn't matter that I was taller and stronger, maybe even faster than this guy. He had the upper hand, and let me tell you, that was not a nice feeling. The force of the kick sent me off balance, but I tried to use the momentum to find my feet. If I was drunk, I'd have been utterly screwed, but since I was sober, I did actually manage to get both feet on the ground before trying to bring myself upright. But no. Another kick hit me right in the corner of the mouth, and I was sent flying backwards again. This time, not only was my mouth filling up with blood, but I could feel the teeth on the left-hand side of my mouth grinding together where the kick had chipped a few of them. It sent my skin crawling as I spat the blood out. I put my hand out and felt something cold and metallic, a fence on which I was once again trying to pull myself up. But again, right as I was about to find my feet, the guy attacked. Only this time, he didn't strike me. He wrapped one arm around my neck and held something cold and sharp over my right eye. I'm not sure if it was a knife or a piece of glass or whatever, but I think that was the single most terrifying moment of my life, thinking that I was going to be blind and hoping I'll be able to buck him off before he went for my throat or something. Only he didn't cut me. Instead, he hissed something right into my ear. Let's just say brevity wasn't his strong suit, and the actual words were as gloating, vicious, and vile as you can imagine, with plenty of references to the date I'd been on that evening. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I just waited for whatever was going to happen. But thank God he must have seen sense or something. He made a comment about how I was only going to be alive the next day because he decided to let me live. After that, he gave me one more good punch to the side of the face. Then all I heard was the sound of trainers hitting concrete as he legged it. I spent the next few minutes spitting out blood as I tried to find my phone. I think he'd either stamped on it or I'd maybe tossed it with a little too much force because the screen was smashed into bits. But again, a little bit of divine intervention meant it worked just enough for me to hammer out an emergency call, after which I dragged myself to the park's gates and sat there waiting for the ambulance to turn up. Aside from a bit of concussion, a lot of swelling and some chipped teeth, I was pretty much all right. There was no skull fracture, no broken orbital socket, nothing like that. Although I'd been lucky to say the least. The doctor said the first wound on the back of my head looked like it had come from a brick or a large rock, and if he'd hit me any harder with it in that particular spot, there's a good chance he'd have just killed me with his first strike. And that was the really scary bit, thinking that all the kicks and punches and threats that came after were like a weird blessing. I was still alive when in some timelines, I would be checking in for the big sleep. I was angry about it for a long, long time. And I'd be a liar if I said I didn't let that attack change my behavior for the worse for a while. Seeing the guy getting 6 years for assault and grievous bodily harm really helped things. But still, that wasn't enough for me on some level, and it took me a while to acquiesce. Me and Lima carried on dating for a few months, which was lovely. But she had to move away for work, so obviously we had to call time on it. And the 4 trips to the dentist were terrible, as they basically had to file and cap my teeth one at a time. And that was definitely the worst part. How 5 minutes turned into an ordeal that lasted months of court dates and dental appointments. That's my one big takeaway from the whole thing, really. How one little misunderstanding can have terrifyingly far-reaching consequences.